I want to welcome viewers and guests here that I've got with me today. We are in part 2 of our conversation about the future of agriculture in Vermont. Last Wednesday, I was joined by Roger Albee, the former Secretary of Agriculture, Clark Hinsdale, the former president of the Vermont Farm Bureau, and Orly Munzing, the founder of Strolling of the Heifers, to talk a little bit about the past. We talked about the history of farming in Vermont, what changes they have seen as folks who have been in agriculture in Vermont for some of them their whole lives, but a lot of the change in the last 30 years, and some of their ideas for building small farms and to really rebuild our rural economy. And if you missed that conversation, you can find a recording on my website at zuckermanforvt.com. You can go to the events page and you'll see a whole slew of recordings that we've had about both that agricultural conversation, but conversations about childcare, education, and many, many other issues. Today, I'm excited to be joined by 2 farmers. We had planned on 3, but one of them is trying to get some hay in before the rains come. Welcome to agriculture. That's the reality. And I'm sure my 2 guests are well aware of that the weather dictates our patterns more than we dictate them ourselves. But these 2 are going to share with us what it's like to be a farmer today, what challenges they face, and what ideas they have to increase local food production in Vermont. If you have thoughts or questions, you can post them in the comments, and we will do our best to include them and bring them into the conversation. Clearly, COVID-19 has really highlighted the need for local healthy food. We all remember those first few days when some of the market shelves went empty. I know demand from my farm went up from some local stores because they couldn't get food from other places. And the demand for local healthy food has really shown not only the need that's out there, but also some of the challenges that many face with food security and food insecurity here in Vermont, as we've seen the lines and everything else. Vermont has a lot of creative small business owners, and many have stepped up to help their neighbors. Many have helped in the communities during the crisis. I know Benji over at Skinny Pancake with shift meals and so forth has also done some work to help get food out to folks. So people, farmers, small business owners are really stepping up. So I'm going to start off by getting in with a little conversation, have our 2 farmer guests tell us a little bit about their farms. I want to invite you each to take a couple of minutes to share a little bit about your farm, what you produce, why you decided to be a farmer, maybe when you started, and what you've seen with some small shifts. But a couple-minute intro, I'm going to start with Dave Chapman from Longland Farm in East Thetford. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. So I actually grew up on a dairy farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And when I left, I never thought I would look back. I had no intention of being a farmer. It was the 70s, the 60s and 70s, and I ended up eventually coming to Vermont as part of the hippie migration of young people, because it was such an exciting place to live. And I actually have been an organic farmer for 40 years now. And most of that time I've been at our farm in East Thetford, Vermont, at a Long Wind Farm. We now grow entirely greenhouse tomatoes in the soil, but in between we went through a very mixed vegetable operation and lots of tractors and lots of summer crew coming in every year. Now we have pretty much of a stable year-round crew. And I think one question maybe that was part of this question was, why did I decide to become a farmer? And really that's because it was so exciting. Farming is the most rewarding occupation in every way except economically. And so it's got everything else that you could want. It's got meaning, and it's just wonderful to be outside and be in the soil. Even for me in the greenhouse, I'm in the soil. So, figuring out the economic koan is the hard part, but it's a pretty great thing to do for a living.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction on your farm. And next, I'd like to introduce and welcome Heather Surprenant from Moonlighting Farm in Varner. And Heather, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what got you into farming and what do you grow?
Sure. So hi, Dave and Dave. thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion, first of all. So I'm co-owner of Moonlighting Farm in Barnard, and we are a small, organic, in practice, diversified vegetable and flower farm. I also have dairy goats and a Jersey cow. This is my first full season owning my own farm in Vermont. For the past 5 years, I have been working on a variety of organic farms throughout the state, just collecting as much knowledge as I can retain on their systems. It's been so instrumental being able to work for so many passionate farmers within the state of Vermont, because it's really shaped how I have chosen to farm myself. I, as a young farmer, so much value the ability to honor those rural traditions that Vermont has. And farming has illuminated all the ways in which that is not only possible, but essential. And, you know, as a young farmer in this state, working with the land feels like the most sincere way that I can connect with my community, but also my values. I didn't really come to farming in the most linear way. I had originally wanted to be a lawyer, and then I quickly decided that that wasn't where my energies were most impactful. But with farming, I see change and growth daily. I get to feed myself and my community, and that feels like one of the most inspiring and rewarding acts of service that I can do. And now not only is farming a lifelong career for me, it is the utmost passion, and I am so in love with the work that I get to do. So that's how I came around with it.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and since we don't have our third guest, George Van Vlaanderen, I was going to mention from Dosley Farm with his spouse, Kristen Doolin, they raise does and make cheese out of that. Brilliant, wonderful cheese. I don't know who's had their cheese before. And like I said, George is out baling hay right now, trying to get it in before maybe this afternoon's rains come. And you know, the quality of your hay can lead to the economics. And I was actually going to move into a question about, you know, the diversity of size and scale of farms, the specificity of a farm like Longland, which is primarily focused on tomatoes. Maybe you do a few other things, David, and then the diversity of a small farm like Heather's, a larger farm like my own. But I'm curious about just straight up the economics of farming. Do you make a living from farming? Do you have to have a different job that helps supplement the situation on the farm? Maybe some years are up, some are down. Heather, you're in your first full year, so you may or may not be able to give that reflection. And employees, and what are the largest financial hurdles you have to overcome? So the economics, you got to pay employees, you got to pay for maybe buildings or equipment. So talk about the economics of farming, if you could. Either one of you is fine.
Sure, I'll speak to that first, actually. I think although I'm coming at farming my own farm the first season, I think that the perspective that I can offer is for young farmers who are trying to start their own farm. I think that we are already at a bit of a disadvantage financially, trying to, one, have access to land, access to the resources to pursue our own farming careers, and also any of the equipment that we might need. So I have a really unique situation. I actually farm on a 200-acre organic beef and hay farm. I live on an established farm property with another farmer who has paved the way for my partner and I to pursue our own organic farm on his land. It functions as a bit of a work share situation where we help him with his beef herd and with haying, and he doesn't necessarily charge us for the 2 acres that we have in vegetable cultivation, which would be exceptionally challenging financially for a young farmer to be able to do. You know, you don't make a lot of money in your first 5 years farming, so it would be almost impossible for me to pursue my own farming career without the help and without the connection of this older established farm. So that's been a really beautiful way to connect a farmer who is 82 and starting to transition out, but is also welcoming in the next generation of farming. So I have to work 2 other jobs, which is why our farm is called Moonlighting Farm. Both my partner and I have other jobs that essentially fund our farm. We are a small wholesaling farm, so we sell to a dairy down the road who does a CSA. We provide their vegetables, and then we sell to the general store in a local market in Randolph. But none of that would actually make up what we need to pay in rent or pay for our seeds or our fertilizer or anything. So it's really just now we're breaking even. So we don't have employees. It is just the 2 of us powering it out. So with that, we're very low impact out of primarily financial reasons. We don't really have the finances to fund machinery. So that is a really, I don't think, a unique way that a lot of young people are having to go about farming, is that shared land space. So that's my economic perspective from a 28-year-old farmer.
Nice. I do see we have George joining us. I'll give him another minute to situate himself, because I had heard he was going to be out doing hay, and but looks like he's got to get his video set up. So Dave, why don't you talk a little bit about just the economics of farming, the challenges, and then we'll have George introduce himself. That's great that you're here, George. Thank you. Dave.
So I do make a living farming, and so do some 35 other people on our farm. So we have a lot of people making a living farming at our farm. But I started just the way Heather did, very small. I started with a team of oxen, was my entire equipment, aside from some old horse-drawn implements that I scrounged up for them. And also I would say that there has been an increase in the number of farmers in America in the last 10 years, but the majority of farmers in America have outside income from a spouse or a partner, some way of helping to supplement the farm income. So it's very dodgy. It's very dodgy for a lot of farms now. Terrible time to be a dairy farmer, and not a great time to be a grain farmer. So terrible time to be an egg farmer. Lots of things that people struggle with economically. And I think that this is a very important part of the conversation, which is, why is it so hard? And, you know, I'm unusual in that instead of having another job so I can farm, I farm so that I can have another job. So I'm also the executive director of the Real Organic Project, and that's a volunteer position for me. And, you know, and I'm very grateful to those 35 people on the farm who make it that I can have some time to do this. And I think that, you know, the Real Organic Project is involved across the country, not just in Vermont, but it's the same for everyone, except Vermont is better. Vermont is better in almost everything. But nonetheless, the reality is that we still get most of our food out of supermarkets, despite our vibrant economic system of direct farm to eater. Even most of the farmers still get a lot of their food out of supermarkets a lot of the year. And so what happens in that system very much affects all of us. And what happens in that system very much affects whether we can make a living, whether we can expand. You know, if there's no access to that system, then you know, it's great. Farmers have this kind of guerrilla economic system going on right now. And COVID showed what happens when eaters change. Because all of a sudden the eaters said, we want to buy local organic food. And as a result, there's this explosion of demand for CSA shares. And, you know, I've heard this from farmers all across the country. We know this is happening. And we know it's happening because the people, the eaters, said, that's what we want to buy. And if they said that to the supermarkets as well and said, we want to buy local organic food, you know, then the supermarkets would carry local organic food. It's not that the supermarkets are totally indifferent to what people want to buy. So it's a big conversation, and I'll be quiet now, but because, you know, we'd like to hear from George, but okay.
Yeah, I'm going to, George, thank you. I thought you might have to stay out on the tractor, bringing in, sound like maybe some hay before the rain comes. So yeah. I'm pleasant. pleasantly surprised and happy to have you here. We had Heather and Dave just explain their farm just for a minute, if you could do that, and then we're talking about the economics of farming. So you could slide into that briefly if you'd like to as well. Welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, the hay is not dry, unfortunately, but we'll deal with it. So the mainstay of our operation is we milk 40 to 50 goats, and we produce about 12,000 pounds of cheese from those goats. Additionally, we raise about 30 pigs a year, and we have an on-site processing facility for making our own sausages. And we've been farming for 21, 22 years. The first 10 years, you guys, someone has alluded to this, is I spent teaching off farm, trying to kind of capitalize our operation and figure out just how to make it work. Both my wife and I have had time for about 12 years now. We have one part-time employee, and yeah, most of our markets are centered around the Burlington area. We only deliver there, so we're only delivering to restaurants, stores, and CSA in the Burlington area, and have limited ourselves to that kind of geographical area. We also have one distributor picks up our cheese, a refrigerated truck, once every couple weeks, and he goes all over the country. And then we deal with Farmers U, which trucks a lot of our cheese down to Boston. Financially, I would say things were going pretty well up until COVID. We kind of figured out more or less how to do this thing after really not making any money for, I want to say, 8 years. Total sweat equity, just figuring stuff out. And I would say over the last 10 years, we've kind of refined our system and got to the point where we were making, I would say, a decent living, putting away money for retirement, all that kind of good stuff. COVID hit, and pretty much all of our markets evaporated. Restaurants went out first. Stores, we had a big boom, and then they collapsed, and we were left kind of figuring out what to do. So briefly, we were still doing wholesale deliveries. I set up a pickup site at each delivery so people could buy our pork and our cheese individually, pre-order. And the response from that was excellent. And that was pretty much all due to social media. And I wouldn't say we're like a great, social media operators. We're kind of figuring that part out too. But I will say without that, we would have had a hard time moving any product. We also just opened up a farm store recently, Saturday, this is the 4th day, and that has been going surprisingly well. Yeah, I'm happy to touch on any of those things, but I'll let someone else take over at this point.
Yeah.
But I have a question for George.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
George, I'm just curious, why do you think that your sales collapsed in the stores for the cheese?
I think people just weren't going to stores as much.
Uh-huh.
And we had this kind of rush initially with COVID, where people were buying toilet paper, goat cheese. After that, people just didn't go to stores. I mean, it didn't totally collapse, but let's say we were at 50%.
I also wonder if, folks used to host other folks for dinner and they would put out, cheese and crackers, they're not going to do that as much when it's just the family at home. It's not as special an occasion, maybe. And I think all of us as farmers are learning. I mean, we had a big push on my farm for the carrots and the parsnips that we still had in storage. For that first 2 weeks, it was like way up. And then again, like George said, it sort of collapsed because everyone stocked up their fridges and their larders. And then they're like, oh, okay, now there's food around. Got it. It's an interesting situation out there. And I'm curious in terms of, farms are a huge part of communities, and farmers are a huge part of the rural community, from fire squads and volunteer fire squads in the old days when people didn't travel 35 minutes or an hour to go to work. Farmers, we're in the community and we're there at all the time. So I'm curious, some of how your, well, whoops, I jumped ahead a little bit. I'm sorry about that. Along with economic hurdles and challenges, what do you see as the role of farms in our rural economy? You know, Dave, you talk about employing 35 people. That's a very different scale than Heather and George, and mine somewhere in between. We have about 10 in the summer and 5 in the winter. What do you see as the role of farms in the rural economy? You know, not just who you employ, but supply chains, and what do farmers need to grow their businesses, be able to sell more food, and maybe build on that rural economy impact that you have? Dave, you've done it. Maybe Heather and George, you're looking at getting bigger or not. I don't know. What do any of you think about the role of farms in the rural economy?
I think farmers need financial resources first and foremost, but I also think that farmers need a receptive community. I think, to me, food access is so interwoven with politics and social justice. And touching a little bit more on the economic side of this, I, as a young farmer, have such a hard time placing a monetary value on the work that I do and figuring out the cost of what I should actually be selling my products for, because I wholeheartedly believe that my vegetables and nutrient-dense food should be accessible to everyone in my community. And I live in a really rural community that is absolutely split down the line, as I'm sure many of us do, between those who are financially able to afford the type of food that I'm producing and those that absolutely cannot. And so finding ways that I think we can meld that food insecurity with a desire to providing food for folks that are already marginalized within our communities, I think is such a pressing element on my mind when it comes to farming. So figuring out how I can make a living is just as important as figuring out how folks can have access to the living that I'm trying to make, if that makes sense.
Tough balance for sure. David or George?
I would just say that I really will always object to the idea that farmers need to charge less for their food in order to deal with poverty. Poverty is a huge social issue. And you know, what's happening is indeed, we have the cheapest food in the history of the world. And people spend a smaller percentage of their annual income on food than has ever happened. And that is happening anywhere else in the world too. America is the home of cheap food, but that cheap food is built on farm workers who can't afford to buy food, you know, and who are completely unprotected by the law. So, you know, most of the farm workers in America, even in Vermont, are Black or brown, and often are undocumented and often have no legal protections. They're poor. So the way our food system works, as Michael Pollan has said, it's based on basically animal cruelty and you know, abusive conditions for people. So if you take good care of animals, have real animal welfare standards, and if you also have good pay for the farmers, David, you and I have been on a panel talking about minimum wage, and you're saying that is my goal, is to pay $15 minimum wage, but I can't afford to pay me, you know? And I think that we see this for lots of farmers. So I just would say that the solution shouldn't be, well, how can we make food cheaper? We know how we do that. We do it industrially. We do it in a factory, and there are real prices to that in terms of nutrition, environment, all these other things, but the food gets cheap. So I think that you know, the way that we approach poverty is also the same way we approach food with quality. That they're the same things.
George, you want anything on that?
Yeah, I agree with David. I mean, I think absolutely right. I'm not, you know, I need to make a certain amount to pay myself and my employee, and I think lowering the price, I think, to make it more accessible is a bigger issue than the farm itself has to face. I think in terms of our role in the community is to provide, healthful food in an environmentally and socially and economically sustainable way. I think a lot of the bottlenecks that I see, well, first of all, I think it's contingent on the farm to produce a product that people are willing to pay more for. I mean, that's, putting aside all of those other issues. In other words, people look and buy your carrot and they say, that is a freaking better carrot than what I can get out of California at 2/3 the price. I think that is the most important, that we have to kind of gain customers on quality. And I think that the public sector can step in. I think the biggest role and some of the biggest bottlenecks that I found, and I see with other farms, are actually kind of they've got a really good product, and they do it in a great way. And I think, they need to kind of vote that part of their farm, what they're doing environmentally. The piece where the public sector can come in, I think, is like trying to facilitate how farms can really access customers, primarily in Vermont. And then I would say, outside of Vermont, since we are kind of a dispersed rural community. Those are just...
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I would add that I think some of how farms help the rural economy is also the landscape that many of you end up creating, the imagery that leads to tourism and other folks coming to Vermont that also boosts the rural economy. These things are all interconnected, and often some of those pieces are forgotten. I'm going to take a moment. I had, before George joined us, I thought, I'm going to pull Saber in because I know she's also a farmer, another diversified farmer. So since I told her I'd let her introduce herself, I'm going to give her the chance. So Saber's on the line with us, and they also produce something different than the rest of us. So maybe, Saber, you can give us just a 2-minute, what do you produce and how do you do all that?
Hi.
We
Oh,
see
wait
you.
a minute.
There you are.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, hi. Well, let's see, we've been farming, we planted an orchard in 1988. And we knew, because we'd been apple pickers in college, that that crop is heavily sprayed. And we knew we didn't want to spray. So we decided to make hard cider. And in terms of, pricing, we were also aware, living in super rural part of Vermont, that cider is, has always been something that local people have made, and it was the original alcohol of New England. And so we kept our prices extremely low for quite a long time. And we were nonetheless able to make a pretty good living with it eventually. We educated the market, which, I guess if I wanted to chime in on anything, I would be talking about consolidation, because I have been involved in some of the efforts that Equal Exchange Coffee Company has worked on and made me aware of. So the grocery store, I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but the point is that, I just go back to quality. We kept to our values very much by making an organic hard cider, and by making it really what cider is. And by educating the market, it became, there were a few of us that did that. Poverty Lane did that, and I guess Woodchuck was one of the early sort of going very, very big. And having had a very high quality market, but having had a very high quality product, what we have seen happen is that it's just been pounced on by agribiz, whatever you want to call it, but to the point where they've redefined what our product is, and it really hurt us for quite a while. And now COVID has just completely decimated us. I mean, we have luckily diversified into making an apple balsamic vinegar, and we just got that into the Hanover Food Co-op, which was a big coup, great thing for us. And it's down in Food Connects is also distributing us. But vinegar is vinegar. It's not, it's not a nice bottle of hard cider and it doesn't sell for as much, and turns out to be very complicated to make. And I don't know if you have other questions, I can go into that. But
Well, thank you just for telling us about another type of operation, because I think for a lot of folks, learning about all the different kinds of operations is great. So thank you for joining for a moment, Saber. I appreciate that. I'm going to return to the three panelists here in terms of, I started talking earlier about how farmers are really connected to the community and involved in the community because you live and work in this space. You don't tend to have to drive an hour to work every day like many Vermonters do. We're one of the most commuting states in the country, pre-COVID, of course. But I'm curious if any of you want to remark on ways you're involved in the community. Either, David, you started touching on Real Organic Project and work you do, and that community is the broader community all over the country and the global food system. And others get involved locally. And I'm just curious if any of the three of you want to touch on some of the community engagement of what you do when you're not farming.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump
Heather.
in on that again. Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm not farming, I am usually very involved in social justice movements throughout Vermont. And currently I am running for the Windsor for One district, a seat in our House of Representatives. I am doing my best to run on a platform that is very rooted in economic dignity for all Vermonters, that is also linked with sustainable farming and agriculture. I think not only do we need more farm voices, but we need more young farm voices in the House. So I am hoping to do my part in educating our community on the importance of the work that small farms can do for our rural and local economies. And I also am hoping to spread a little bit more information about some of the economic hardships that Vermonters face and how I can blend that in with my platform currently. So yeah, that's how I'm doing it.
David, maybe you can tell us about the Real Organic Project and what that's all about, plus anything else that you do that I don't know about.
Yeah, no, I don't do any. Okay, yes, I do. I teach Tai Chi. That brings another community of about 50 or 60 people to the farm 3 or 4 times a week, and it is a wonderful community building activity. The thing about the Real Organic Project is when we began it, it began in Vermont, and it began with a meeting of about 30 farmers at the NOFA headquarters. And it was in despair, really, at all our efforts at reform of the USDA had failed. And the question was, do we walk away and just say, well, that's life, or do we do something? And the overwhelming consensus, the 100% consensus of the group was that we do something. And that led to the formation of the Real Organic Project. But I just say it's interesting because the decision we had right from the beginning is, are we going to make this a Vermont thing? Are we going to make this a Northern New England thing? And we were getting voices from across the country, farmer voices saying, please don't leave us out. We know that Vermont can do it without Oklahoma, but Oklahoma can't do it without Vermont. And I think that one of the things that I've come to see is that the Vermont has a unique place in the national imagination, and it's true. And it's why we have Bernie Sanders, right? And it's why when we say something in Vermont, it has an undue influence in the rest of the country. We have the ability to make changes in this little state, the brave little state, that really can have a big influence on the national dialogue. And so I think it's important. I think it's important what we do, and to realize that we easily have the power to affect much larger change based on the little programs, the little decisions that we make in Vermont. The GMO labeling bill that you were so involved with, David, was going to be a game changer. And indeed, it brought about a terrible corporate response of really bad business in Congress. And it was how they shut it down. But that's because they knew they were going to lose because of what Vermont did. And Vermont was the first state that had the courage to go up against Monsanto and say, go ahead and sue us. So.
And we actually won the first round of that court case.
Yeah.
Which is why they went to Washington and spent $120 million to lobby to throw our law out with now, was he Secretary of State Pompeo was the lead person that undercut our law for consumers have a right to know what's in their food. George, I don't know if you and Kristen do a lot in the community right now. Oh, can't see.
Hold it up. Oh, he's muted.
Oh,
Can you unmute him, David?
I don't know.
Your people?
I can't, but maybe Colleen can try. There you go, George.
So yeah, we are intermittently involved with school groups. So I correspond with different grades. So we do letters and things of that sort, kind of updating kids what we're doing month to month. And that usually kind of coalesces into a field trip at the farm where kids learn about goats and, we run around and we have working border collies and use draft horses to do most of our farm work. So kids kind of get a taste of that. And the other thing I do is I play in a local band. We're like the only band in Bakersfield, so we get called on for a lot of benefits and stuff like that, Sugar on Snow and other fun stuff, 4th of July. That's about the extent of it.
Yeah, I see the banjo behind you there. If we had more time, we'd have you pluck out a tune for us there. That'll be a lot of fun. So in terms of agriculture, like if we want to really expand local agriculture in Vermont, it sounds like, George, your farm sort of found a scale and a set of markets that you're pretty happy with. Doesn't sound like you want to grow bigger, but maybe, Heather, you've just started, and Dave talked about how he started with just an acre or two, and then now he's got 35 employees. What opportunity is there to grow, and or what would need to happen to help farms grow that want to grow? Some don't want to. What do you think the impediment to, Vermont feeding itself? What would we need to do? I've told people, for instance, on my farm, in late October, we have almost 100,000 pounds of food in storage. But frankly, that's less than 1 pound of food for one day for the residents of Chittenden County. So with the COVID situation and everyone freaking out about food, when we really look around, we have a lot of local farms, but actually for the volume that we need to eat, we're a long way from feeding ourselves. What do you think might be some of the things that would need to happen? Sabra's chimed in about community infrastructure, freezers, community root cellars, community kitchens. What do you all think?
I can start.
Sure.
I think there are models out there of citizens who have demanded that the food system change. Denmark is a really powerful model where, because the organic movement was had allies in the environmental movement, they managed to get their Congress, their government, to set aside $150 million over a 5-year period to take the country as much organic as they could. And that, in American terms, in our economy, that'd be about $19 billion, which is still small change in America, but it's huge, and the impact would be huge. And that was done because they'd created a consumer movement that was demanding this. It wasn't just farmers, it was eaters. And it wasn't just eaters saying that they wanted to eat organic. They were saying that how agriculture is conducted in our country has a huge impact on climate. It has a huge impact on water and air quality. It has a huge impact on our social structure. So, they organized and did that. The state of Sikkim in India did the same thing. And basically, by law, they were going to take the whole state organic. Vermont could do that. And as bonus points, it's become an incredible tourist destination because people want to go and see, well, why are they doing this? So I think that there are many ways in which this could play out. There are many programs that we'd love to see funded, but the key ingredient is citizen activism and citizens saying, we care, we want these choices, we want to support this kind of agriculture. I think that COVID has been a huge push towards getting local regional agriculture going. I realized that, especially for people who are selling to restaurants, it's been a disaster. But most of the farmers I know who were selling to restaurants have managed to switch to CSAs successfully. So it's interesting that George says he has trouble selling his cheese, because I would love to buy that cheese, and I still can't get the food I want often, even in local co-ops. And so I think that connecting the dots, we have this enormous consumer demand, and we have farmers who want to grow it. And in between, there is a serious corporate barrier. And that's a real thing, that the supermarkets right now are being owned by fewer and fewer companies. And the distributors, there's fewer and fewer distributors. So there are getting to be stronger gatekeepers the moment we get out of farm to table type of connections.
I'm curious about Heather, though, for you, I think about a farm of your size, and if you wanted to get bigger and be able to store food for the winter, it's hard to have the capital to build that kind of storage. Do you think there are a lot of 2 and 4 acre diversified farms that, if either the community or the state or multiple farms together collaborated to build storage facilities, would enable you to grow and provide more food year round than the seasonal summer production? Or am I barking up an unreal tree?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think touching upon the idea of collective farming is what interests so many young people to get into farming in general. We love the idea of shared resources because, the reality of it is we don't necessarily have the resources ourselves to put those infrastructures into our own farms. So collectively forming something like a root cellar or drying space for any of our storage crops would be spectacular. I think when I look at the idea of feeding a larger amount of people, I am a little daunted by it. But I also think that the way I look at farming is from a perspective of starting small and almost being okay with being a small farm too. I think a lot of people that I talk to who are really not convinced that small farms are going to be what changes the food system or changes the climate, they always come at me with this perspective of, how are you going to feed everyone on the scale that you farm? And I look at them and I tell them, I'm not trying to feed everyone, and I'm not trying to even feed all of Vermont. What I'm focused on is trying to feed my community and knowing that that's what I can do within my own reach, and feeling like that is enough right now until I have the means to grow and the means to expand. I think that you can only take on so much within that in terms of labor, but where you can take on that conversation is by educating people, is through advocacy, is through informing folks on the small scale organic movement that a lot of us are part of. So yes, I would love to do more of a community collective farming. I think that would be so helpful for my own farming that I'm doing, but at the same time, I am very realistic about the scope and the impact that I can have. And as long as I'm having an impact on my community, that feels like a pretty small win, but a good win also.
Thank you.
Yeah.
George, I want to give you a chance on this question, then we're going to do a quick 1 minute each wrap as we're getting near the end. So I don't know, George, what you want to throw in on this for a minute, and then we'll close out.
Try to be quick. So I think if we're talking about growing kind of our local food economy, I really think that's not a supply question. I don't think it's about farms necessarily getting bigger. We've more or less remained the same size for 15 years, and we want to stay that size. But I think there are a lot of compelling financial reasons to stay relatively small or capitalize on economies of scale and get much larger. I think when you're in between, you're interested. So anyway, in terms of building, a stronger food movement, I think that needs really to be demand driven. So consumers have to be out there voting with their dollars for better food. And I think to get there, David touched on this, we need a level playing field. Let's get rid of all of the subsidies to big corn and soy, everything in our broken system, so that we can and account for all of the environmental and social cost of agribusiness, and so that we can kind of compete at least on a somewhat level playing field. I think the second thing that could happen is access to credit for farms. You know, like we're in a financial position that we were able to dump $5,000 into our farm store and get that running because we're 20 years into farming. We've done a moderately good job, but I can say that when I was at Heather's point in farming, there's no way I could have done that. And I'm not sure how I would have accessed credit to actually build the store. So I think that's an important piece. I think a third thing that could happen is really kind of leveraging existing resources that are out there. So I think of like tech centers at high schools. I think of UVM and Vermont colleges as having a wealth of resources for you know, young people that are into tech or into social media, that can put together kind of a database of, say, farms who were delivering to different areas and could say, hey, you know, I'm going down to Montpelier, you know, those kind of resources I think could really help. And then, you know, finally, I will say that for 20 years, we kind of but basically concentrated our resources on marketing to the Burlington area, because that's where the population density is and that's where the money is. And I can say that when that more or less evaporated, starting our farm store and promoting our products locally in the community, I'm surprised at how much response we've had from local people who don't necessarily have much money. So that's been really promising, and I think it's a quality thing there too. And the last thing I'll say about that is that a farm store in your local community really breaks down a lot of those delivery barriers. You know, granted, they're small, but you know, there are places like Thousand Stone Farm in Brookfield that are killing it in their farm store, and they live in these, you know, it's a tiny little community, they're way off the beaten track, and you know, they're not only selling their own stuff, but they're an income generator for various farms and small businesses around them. So I think that could be a powerful piece in growing the food.
Great. Yeah, so I had hoped to give everyone a minute to wrap, but I'm actually getting really tight on time to go run the Senate, which is another part of my job along with farming and running these kinds of discussions. If anybody's got like a 30-second, what do you want viewers, community members, elected leaders, or others to keep in mind as we think about farming in Vermont's rural economy? Do like a 5-word hot snap. What do you think is really key for people to think of? David first, then I'm going to go to Heather, then I'm going to go to George, and then I'm going to wrap it up. You got it.
Go to
5-10 words.
realorganicproject.org and check it out. It's a really fascinating conversation. It's fun. It's interesting. Everybody should be part of it.
All right, Heather, what do people need to think about?
Support local, but also dig a little deeper into food justice.
George.
Learn where your food is coming from, you know, whether it's locally or nationally or internationally. Get a sense of how that food is produced.
Well, I want to thank all three of you, George, for screaming right in on the last second. Good luck if that hay might dry before the rain comes. I don't know. I've got some straw down. We were talking about it before you got here. But thank you all three for joining me. Sabra, thank you for chiming in for a moment. We've got some other guests that came in, one with a cute baby picture, so that's awesome. Thanks for watching, and look forward to more of these conversations. Please do feel free to reach out to my campaign, send me ideas, info@zuckerman4vt.com. You can also reach out, of course, to the Lieutenant Governor's office anytime with feedback about policies that are happening, and would welcome your ideas, your thoughts. And of course, since this is on the campaign side, we'd love to have your support as well. Zuckerman4vt.com. Thank you all for joining, and hopefully we get a little bit of rain for those farms that are needing rain, and maybe it holds off for another handful of a day, half a day for George to get his hay in. So that just goes to show all the different kinds of farms, what we need don't always mean the same thing. And thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I think Colleen has killed the live stream. I'm going to take off because I got to run. Thank you so much for joining and helping out.
All right, David.
See you,
Bye-bye.
David.